Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. A very warm welcome to the 2022 ASEM Forum on Human Rights of Older Persons, Present and Future. My name is Minhwa Kim, and thank you for having me as your MC today. Well, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to all the speakers and attendees, both offline and online, for attending this meaningful forum. Well, this is day 2, and today is also going to be a day full of discussions and presentations on how to relieve the loneliness of older persons through sessions 3 and 4. And the session 4 is special session held in collaboration with WHO. And we are now being live streamed through YouTube channels so that more people across the world can be engaged in this forum. And I look forward to your participation until the end of this forum. Well, without further ado, let's begin session 3. This session will be conducted under the topic of addressing loneliness from governmental perspectives. So for this session, I'd like to introduce the moderator for these sessions, Deputy Research Fellow Eun-ha Nam-gung of Korea Institute for Health and Social Affairs and Deputy Director Yuri Lee of Ministry of Health and Welfare. So please welcome them with a big round of applause.
Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. As being introduced, I'm Eun-ha Nam-gung, an Associate Research Fellow at the Korea Institute for Health and Social Affairs. First of all, I'd like to welcome our attendees online and those in this meeting room. I'm in charge of moderating the session on addressing loneliness from governmental perspectives. It's my great honor to moderate this session, and I would like to express my sincere appreciation to ASEM Global Center for organizing this session around this important topic. Loneliness has increasingly become a pressing social and mental health issue, especially for older adults. And some countries started to address the issue at the macro policy levels. With this in mind, we have invited presenters from the governments around the world, where policy measures on later-life loneliness are actively developed and implemented. Each of the presenters will present the governmental institutions in charge of loneliness and other policy measures to address loneliness among older adults in each country. We have invited Ms. Emma Barrow as our first presenter. She is a policy advisor at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport in the UK. Unfortunately, she is not available to join us today, probably because of the UK's recent changes at the governmental or political level. Please understand this unexpected change in our program. Nevertheless, we think the UK case is very important as they created a ministerial lead for loneliness for the first time around the world. Therefore, I will briefly describe the background and process of the establishment of the lead in the UK. The Joe Fox Commission was established by a British member of Parliament, Joe Fox, in 2016 in order to investigate ways to reduce loneliness. It published its final report in 2017. The Commission worked with 30 charities, such as Age UK and Action for Children, to produce the report and outline the ways to combat loneliness in the report. The report contains the following recommendations in 3 areas. The first one is national leadership, including the nomination of a lead minister. The second is measurement, including developing a national indicator and annual reporting. And third, extending funding to combat loneliness. The UK government reacted to these 3 recommendations. First, In January 2018, Prime Minister Theresa May accepted the report's recommendations, creating a ministerial lead for loneliness with the intention to ensure that loneliness reduction remains an enduring parliamentary priority. In fact, the position is often referred to by the media as the Minister for Loneliness, but it is not a separate ministerial office. It sits within the remit for the Minister for Sport and Civil Society. Second, in October 2018, as a result of the report, the UK government published a loneliness reduction strategy for the first time in the world. The strategy included commitments for loneliness reduction activity by 9 different governmental departments. One example is to encourage social prescribing by frontline doctors so that they can refer patients suffering from loneliness to local group activity and befriending schemes. Third, in May 2020, the UK government distributed over £20 million to various initiatives to reduce loneliness. The initiative included funding to charities dedicated to combating loneliness and to loneliness reduction projects run by both tech private firms and community groups. The UK government's move to create a ministerial lead in loneliness has surprised many people in the world and at the same time inspired many policymakers. It has also shown how much loneliness has been a serious problem affecting many people in our society today. Since the UK started to publish the loneliness strategy, some governments, including Japan, Netherlands, France, Germany, have started to address loneliness as their national policy agenda. We today hear from the governments of Japan, Germany, and Korea in their strategies to tackle loneliness. Our first presenter is Mr. Masanova Ogura, the Minister for Loneliness and Isolation in Japan. His presentation title is Japan's Effort to Tackle Loneliness and Isolation. We will listen to his talk through his recorded presentation. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Ogura.
Kind attention.
Thank you, Mr. Ogura, for the interesting and very informative information. I believe we could learn a lot about the background and process of creating policy agendas and principles to address loneliness in Japan, as well we can also learn about the specific actions, such as conducting a nationwide survey and establishing a public-private collaborative platforms in Japan. It seems like Japan also emphasized the active role of both central and local governments to tackle loneliness at the various levels, including individual, community, and national levels. Our next presenter is Dr. Matthias von Schubanen-Frigen, Director General at the Federal Ministry for Family Affairs, Senior Citizens, Women, and Youth in Germany. Dr. Schubanen-Frigen's presentation title is Addressing Loneliness, Federal Republic of Germany. I'd like to invite Dr. Schubanen-Frigen for his presentation.
Well, hello everyone, and hello to South Korea and to Seoul, and thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak about this very important topic, which is quite crucial in German politics. If you look at the ongoing coalition agreement, it is addressed several times in the agreement that we have to tackle that the German federal government has to tackle loneliness. So it is very important for us. It is very important for other countries in Europe. And as we could have just seen, it is very important for South Korea and especially also for Japan. So thank you very much for choosing this topic. Thank you, South Korea. Next slide, please. So if you look at this slide, the dark blue spots, they are loneliness. The feeling of loneliness is high. So you can see it in the northeast of Germany, up near the Baltic, on the Baltic Sea. The feeling of loneliness is quite high. But if you go to the south, it's lower. And perhaps we don't really know, but perhaps there's a correlation between, on the one hand, the feeling of loneliness, and perhaps on the other hand, the feeling and having being better off economically. So, and if you look at the right side of the slide, you can see that the loneliness was quite low in 2017, and I think it will not surprise you that after in the COVID pandemic in 2020 and 2021, it went quite high up. So there's a correlation between COVID-19 and the isolation we experienced during this time, and loneliness. So this gives us a kind of need for action to address loneliness in Germany. And if you look at the age groups on the right side of the slide, you can see that older people are slightly more affected by loneliness than younger people. But that we could have seen that during the pandemic. It's loneliness is not only a problem for the older generation, the generation 61 to 70, but it's also a question for younger people. And it's quite surprising that the groups are kind of together in the statistics. Thank you. Next slide, please. So we have several projects, and on the left side you can on the left side of the photo you can see my minister Lisa Paus starting our loneliness campaign. We have several projects. One project is called Kompetenznetz Einsamkeit. I will talk about that. Another project is financed by the European Commission. Another project is financed by Malteser. So we have several projects in Germany, and we try to get them together to work together to fight loneliness. Next slide, please. So we have a loneliness network, which I want to talk about. It started in in the beginning of 2022, and it will go on. That's our plan at the moment. Perhaps it will go on for longer, but it will go on until December 2024. And it targets loneliness in all age groups and all life situations, because our statistics show that, and I showed it on the other slide, that loneliness is not only a problem for older people. It's a problem, and we could see that during the pandemic when schools closed down and sports clubs didn't open. It was a huge problem for the younger generation as well, and many of them felt very lonely during this time of the pandemic. So it's a problem for all age groups, and we cannot say that as older you get, as more lonely you might be. That is not true. But if you become older and you have problems like health problems or economical problems, then you can be lonely, or you can get into a situation of loneliness. So age is not a fact that makes you lonely. So our goal is to promote the development and the exchange of knowledge on possible prevention and intervention measures in Germany. So that's the goal of our loneliness network. We do research with the ministry finances, research on factors that promote and hinder the prevention and tackling of loneliness. And we meet in this network regularly, and we have a discourse-based development of strategies against loneliness in cooperation with scientists, politicians, and stakeholders from civil society. So we get we get our local communities we have our local communities in this network. We have the Länder, the federal Länder in the network. So we try to get everyone together, and we try to have a thorough discussion on the topic. And it is science-based, this network, which is very important for us. And we work on a strategy for Germany to tackle loneliness, which will be presented during the next year, the second half of 2023. And one important goal of this network is also the dissemination of knowledge among professionals and the public. So we try to get more awareness of this problem of loneliness, so that a person shouldn't think that it's her or his fault to be in a situation of loneliness. Next slide, please. So the goal is to overcoming loneliness, actions against and having action against loneliness. And as I said, sorry about that, in our coalition agreement, it is addressed twice. So it's also for the federal politics. It is a topic. And we need a strategy to counter loneliness. And as I said in the beginning, the target groups are not only older people. It used to be like that in the past, but as I said, we think, and we have, and that is fact-based, that loneliness is a topic for all age groups. So we have to broaden the target groups, and we should not focus only on older people. We should include the entire life course. So the focus we are having is on preventing and combating social loneliness, and thus also on strengthening social cohesion. So the society has to get together, and especially in the in the current situation where the Ukraine is facing a war. So the society in Europe has to get together. So the first goal is to strengthen low threshold support, and I showed you on the second slide that we have several projects, and they are all low threshold projects. The second goal is, as I said, raising awareness in society so that loneliness is not the fault of one single person who faces a situation of loneliness, or it's not the fault of older people. So that we have to raise this awareness. And the third goal is offering network services and expanding research. As I said, we find that my ministry is financing a lot of research on loneliness, and we offer services. Our next steps, we will, in October this year, we will start a program, we call it ESF Plus program, which is partly financed by the European Commission against loneliness, with 87 low threshold projects all over Germany, in the east, in the west, in the north, and in the south. And we're looking forward to the start. My minister will start it. And I think it will be a very, very important step. And as I said, it's a low threshold project where we finance places where people get together, where we finance, for instance, trainings to use the internet, to use a computer, especially for older people, so that they can get into contact with other people, with their families. So those are little examples of these low threshold projects. We have a so-called Einsamkeitsbarometer, which means loneliness barometer, monitoring of loneliness in Germany, so that we can see if things change, if things get better, or if things get worse. And that starts in 2023. And we will have a first pilot report in December 2022. So I'm looking forward to this project because it will tell us on a scientific base how things are going, how things are in Germany regarding loneliness. Next slide, please. We look at other countries as well. Britain, they have a national loneliness strategy since 2018. We were quite surprised that Britain started it. We have heard about Japan, the Minister Against Loneliness and Social Isolation since 2021. We have just heard about the situation in Japan. We look at the Netherlands. They started a project, several projects as well. So we look at other countries to get information, so we don't have to invent the wheel again, so that we can learn from each other. And thanks to South Korea for having this workshop, this panel on loneliness, so we can learn from each other. Yeah, we have to, if you look at the situation globally, to reduce social isolation and loneliness, we have to create a coalition to increase political commitment. That's what we're having in Germany with the coalition agreement. We have to improve research and evidence for what works. That's what we that's what we do in our loneliness network. And we have to scale up effective interventions. That's what we do. Yeah, and I think it is very important. Next slide, please. Yeah, I talked about this new project financed by the European, or co-financed by the European Commission, which is called Strengthening the Participation of Older People, Countering Loneliness and Social Isolation. We start with this project. We start for the people, for workers aged 60 and over. This is a start, but as I said, loneliness is not, and that's the evidence we're having in Germany. Loneliness is not only a problem for the older generation. We will, in 1 or 2 years, we will start with project for the younger generation as well. The main objectives are preventing and combating involuntary loneliness and social isolation. You have to think loneliness together with social isolation, because loneliness on its own, some people want to be lonely sometimes. So if loneliness comes together with social isolation, then people get into problems. We want to improve the income and living situation of older workers, both during active employment and in the post-occupational phase. We want to help them to change when they change their life from working every day 9 to 5 in the afternoon, and then they suddenly get a pension and have to change their lives, and often people get into difficult situations. So this period we want to support people. We have to support communities on a community level to have participatory structures for older people. So these are our 3 main objectives of this new program we are starting in October this year. Applicants can be non-profit voluntary welfare organizations and independent non-profit organizations. Applicants can also be municipalities, counties, independent cities, and districts in a city-state, like in Bremen, in Hamburg, or in Berlin. So I think you have to have a network on the community level. You have to have the community working together with non-profit organizations. And we fund socially innovative projects with new ideas and concepts to achieve the program's objectives. So yeah, we on the one hand side, we have projects like this one, which will be our kind of flagship. On the other side, we have let's say political, or we have a network where we get all stakeholders together. As I said, NGOs, the Länder, the communities, science, several ministries. So that's our network, which works together, which works on a strategy. And on the other side, as I said, we have several projects like this one, or our kind of flagship, co-financed by the European Commission. Thank you very much.
Dr. Schubang and Frigen, thank you very much for sharing the specific policy interventions implemented in Germany to address loneliness, including ESF Plus program to tackle loneliness in old age. I think COVID-19 pandemic and an increased risk of loneliness seems to be an important motivation to actively develop governmental attendances in UK for all individuals over their life course. I also think, similar to Japan, Germany emphasizes collaboration across governmental, community, and academic centers to address loneliness. Please let us know if you have any questions. We will collect all your questions on Dr. Shuban and Flagen's presentation and the next presentation by Ms. Yuri Lee, and we will discuss them at the end of this session. For those of you who are attending this session through the YouTube live streamed video, please feel free to leave your questions in the chat box. The last but not least presentation is on policies in Korea. The presenter is Ms. Yuri Lee, Deputy Director at the Senior Policy Division, Ministry of Health and Welfare in South Korea. She will present the policy measures to address later life loneliness in Korea. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Yuri Lee to the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm Deputy Director of Yuri Lee of Ministry of Health and Welfare. Today, I'm going to talk about directions for Korea's welfare policies for older persons. We have a variety of policies, but I'm going to introduce our efforts to reduce loneliness and isolation. Before I start, I'd like to sincerely thank the AGAC for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. We, Ministry of Health and Welfare, or MOHW, have protected social vulnerable groups, and we are providing policies to ensure people are living healthy. And I'm going to talk about policies for welfare. In my division, we are implementing and designing policies for older persons and their welfare. And among many policies, in line with the themes, I'm going to talk about policies regarding how to reduce loneliness and isolation. First, let me touch upon status of welfare policies for older persons. As you know the situation today, Korea is experiencing a rapid aging. In 2017, older population accounted for 14.2% of the total population, which means we entered into an aged society. And currently, older population accounts for 16.6%. And by 2025, older population will take up 20.3% of the population, which means we will enter into a super aged society. In that regard, there has been an increased demand for welfare and older persons. In particular, there are increasingly more older persons and those who need care. In particular, older persons living alone was 1.67 million in 2021, and by 2030 the figure is expected to increase to 2.49 million. In particular, the number of dementia patients is on the rise. So, we have seen an dramatic increase in expenditure for welfare for older persons. In 2021, budget for welfare for older persons were allocated as 19 trillion. And about 21% of the budget was used for older persons policies. And medical expenses for older persons have also gone up. In 2010, it was 14.1 trillion won, but it increased to 36.7 trillion won in 2021. And the total medical cost of the total population is about 80 trillion won, but about 30% is used for older persons. So I just talked about status of policies and demographics of older persons. Then let me shift gears toward the living conditions of older persons. We MOHW carry out a survey every 3 years for living conditions of older persons. So every 3 years, we publish a report and make an announcement regarding that. And according to the result of the survey, more older persons are likely to live alone. As you can see on the graph, you can see the portion of older persons living alone has been increased from 68.1% to 78.2%. And when we carried out a survey of older persons, the portion of older persons who want to live with their children decreased from 27.6% to 12.8%. So older persons are less likely to live with their children and they are more likely to live alone. So this is how the trends have changed. So with such trends in mind, we need to look at family care and social network, which have been weakened. So we carried out a survey and asked a question to older persons, how many times do you communicate with friends or families? So compared to 2017, 78.2% of older persons said they communicate with neighbors or friends once a week, more than once a week. But it has decreased. And also, they said once a week they communicate with their relatives or others, family members, and that portion was 38%, but it also decreased. So when it comes to health and depression of older persons, we have seen some improvement. So we also conducted a survey regarding older persons' health and depression. The portion in 2008, 24.4% of respondents said that they are in good health, but the portion has increased to 30.8%. But the green bar shows the portion of respondents showing symptoms of depression, but the figure has decreased to 13.5%. But 24.4% said they are in good health. And compared to the average, which is 13.5%, those who are living alone or with no spouse are more likely to have symptoms of depression with the portion of 19.2%. So living alone or social isolation and loneliness are the major causes of mental health issues of older persons, which we were able to find through statistics and survey. So then I'm going to touch upon current status and future directions of welfare policies for older persons. As I mentioned before, we have a variety of policies in many areas, but I'm going to focus on directly isolation or loneliness related policies. There are three major areas. First is support for active later life. We provide job opportunities and support social activities for older persons. And second, we provide support for healthy later life, including care services for them. And third is support for dignity in later life to protect their human rights and to prevent elder abuse and solitary death. Let's look at the first one. For active later life of older persons, we provide jobs and support for social activities. And between 60 to 65, many older persons get retired, but they want to engage with more social activities. So to facilitate that and to help them earn income, secure income, we provide them with job opportunities. And as of 2022, 845,000 older persons have been supported in the forms of job opportunities by the government. And there are many job opportunities for older persons, and some of them is pro bono activities. For example, child caring activities or transportation guide services. So older persons can take part in some pro bono activities for the society. And with their skills and experience, we provide some social activity jobs to older persons so that they can use their skills and activities. And also, we have some policies to induce and encourage older persons to engage with social activities. And at the same time, we have provided some support for market-based job opportunities, so-called. So at a silver cafe, older persons can earn income and they can work at such silver cafe. So this is one type of job opportunities we provide for older persons. And such job opportunities can help older persons to have better health and better social network. And according to a study, older persons engaging with jobs or engaging social activities have 70,000 won less medical expenses for their health. And if we translate it into a social cost, then a total of 720 billion won can be saved every year. So that is the result of the study. And older persons' participation can reduce loneliness level and depression level. At the same time, groups at risk of depression will also decrease. So to reduce loneliness and isolation, we will expand and provide more job opportunities for older persons, and also we will make sure to improve the quality of such jobs and job opportunities provided to older persons.
두 번째로는 그 노인의 이런
And
활동적인 이런 노후 생활을
for
지원하기
active
위해서
later
필수
life of
역량이
older
있고,
persons,
또 여가 활동을
we have
지원하기
supported
위해
their
있습니다.
leisure activities.
우리나라의 저출산 고령사회 기본법이나 노인
So if you look at Framework Act on Low Birth Rate in an Aging Society, or if you look at Welfare of Senior Citizens Act, there are some provisions that stipulate the local government and the state should encourage older persons to engage in leisure activities. So municipalities have some leisure centers for older persons. For example, Senior Welfare Center, and there are about 410 centers in the country. And also we have senior citizen centers where older persons can get together for activities. And we also provide courses for older persons. And we have provided lectures and learning programs for hobbies. And also we are making sure that older persons can engage with health exercise courses and they can get meals together as well. So even though older persons are living alone, they can get together in the daytime and they can exchange at such facilities. With this, I believe we have been contributing to reducing loneliness and isolation of older persons. And let me introduce care services for older persons living alone. And we have some public services. So we, MOHW, is providing customized care services for older persons. And we provide care services to frail and vulnerable older persons who need help in daily lives. And we do not provide 24/7. We provide services 16 to 40 hours a week for care for older persons. Of course, older persons living alone can use services, or those with poor physical functions or mental difficulties can also get help from our care services. About 500,000 people have been supported by our services. Let's look at the services in detail. Social workers and daycare service providers offer care services for older persons. They visit regularly. Sometimes they make a phone call to them, and they encourage older persons to engage with social activities. Sometimes they can they can give support for their daily lives, and sometimes they can go out with them for activities. In particular, during the heat wave or cold wave, in those seasons, we provide intensive care to them, and we provide some equipment or devices for heating and air conditioning. In particular, we take care of older persons in isolation or with depression or suicidal ideation. We help them engage social activities. And there are many care services for older persons living alone, and among them is emergency safety relief service. So, inside their home, we install ICT devices so that we can detect risks. So, if there is an emergency or risk, we can immediately involve to enhance the safety of older persons. And nationwide, 130,000 households have been supported with these care services. And this is not limited to the support for older persons. And for older persons who have difficulties living their daily lives, so for them, we are operating long-term care insurance program. So it is an institutional program for older persons. And there are two types of long-term care insurance services. First is admission to long-term care services. And second is stay-at-home care services. And stay-at-home care service is provided by daycare provided throughout the day or night, and sometimes stay-at-home care services include daycare, night care, short-term care, home visiting care, and providing equipment or devices for welfare. And we have been committed to expanding such stay-at-home care services, and not just with these care services, but we are trying to integrate nursing services into stay-at-home services. And also, we will provide support so that older persons can enjoy a variety of stay-at-home care services. So to protect human rights older persons, we are carrying out activities for elder abuse prevention as well. And we are operating elder abuse reporting hotline 24/7, 365 so that we can get reports for elder abuse. Anyone can make a report in case of elder abuse, but medical workers, care service providers, or paramedics are obliged to report in case of elder abuse. And also, we are operating elder abuse prevention institutions, and there are currently 37 institutions around the country. And we are also operating 19 shelters where older persons or victims can get counseling services. And last but not least, I'm going to introduce the recent trends. So far, I have covered traditional measures and projects to deal with loneliness and isolation and to reduce risks. And this part is a newly introduced one and newly introduced efforts. In Korea, solitary death has become an important social issue. Solitary death is about older persons living alone die because of diseases or sometimes they commit suicide and their body is found later on. So it can be regarded as solitary death and it has become a serious issue. So we recently enacted Act on the Prevention and Management of Solitary Death, and in 2021 April it entered into force, and the act defined solitary death, and because of this act, the state and local governments are responsible for solitary death, and also the act laid the foundation for counseling education for survey, support measures, and promotion. And in line with the implementation, we MOHW is currently planning master plan for the prevention of solitary death. And to prevent and to identify the current status, we are currently carrying out a survey. And to prevent solitary death, we are currently doing pilot projects. So from August this year, for risk groups for solitary death, So we are trying to early identify those who at risk for solitary death and help them. So including Seoul and Busan in other and 7 areas. So in a total 8 provinces in the country, we are carrying out such pilot projects. So loneliness and isolation should be dealt with in a systematic manner. So to that end, we started this project. Of course, the prevention and management of solitary death is not just confined to older persons like in Germany. So youth can be targeted people for this act. So to prevent and manage solitary death in the country, we just started some projects and programs. So with this, I have introduced 3 areas for our policies for welfare of older persons to reduce loneliness and isolation. And we are also expecting to expand those policies and the scope of them. So citizens' support and interest would be very much appreciated. And I also hope older persons can get together with other generations so that they can have a happy later life. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lee, for your interesting and informative presentation. Ms. Lee introduced the major policies for older adults to address loneliness, including the provision of health and social care, the provision of social participation opportunities for older adults, and the prevention of elder abuse. She also talked about the recent enactment of the Act on the Prevention and Management of Lonely Death. So for now, we have all 3 presenters for this session, and we have corrected some questions on the presentation by Dr. Shubhanan Fragen and for the presentation by Yuri Lee. We have 4 questions for each presenter. So I will read it through all questions for both presenters to give you some time to prepare answers to the questions. I will read through the 4 questions to Dr. Shubhanan Fragen first. The first question is, obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought up the issues of loneliness more pressingly. However, arguably, loneliness had been affecting many people, particularly older adults, before the pandemic. When did the government actually start to recognize the seriousness of loneliness in Germany? Did the UK and Japanese appointment of loneliness ministers influence the German government to address loneliness as a national policy agenda? This is the first question. And the second question is, what would be an advantage of addressing loneliness as a national agenda in your opinion? The third question is, can you tell us about the pattern of loneliness in Germany that are different from other countries? And the last question is, while learning from other countries' strategies in tackling loneliness, what are the main characteristics or specifications of the German government's approach to address loneliness? Those are the questions for Dr. Shubhanan Fragen. And we have 4 questions to Yuri Lee. And the first one is, as a person working for the Korean government, how do you see other countries move to address loneliness as a national policy agenda, such as the UK and Japan? Do you think this is a good and necessary step? And the second question is, as you mentioned in the presentation, Korea is experiencing rapid aging and the rapid rise in single occupancy household, particularly among the older population. While the Korean government and Ministry of Health and Welfare has introduced many policies to help older people to integrate into the community and to prevent lonely deaths. Korea is still a country of the highest suicide rate among older people in the world, and lonely deaths among older people are still very high. The Korean government seems to focus on how to identify people with a higher risk of lonely deaths and respond to them quickly, rather than addressing its root cause, such as depression and loneliness. In your opinion, what are the weaknesses or limitations of Korean government's approach that need to be corrected or improved? The third question is, do you think addressing loneliness can be a more effective preventive measure to depression, suicide, and lonely death? And the final question for Yuri Lee is, how likely is the Korean government to introduce a loneliness ministry or division? Those are the questions for each presenter. And Dr. Shubhane Fragen, are you ready to answer those questions?
Sure, and thank you very much for the interesting questions and the important questions. Well, first you asked for what changed during COVID-19, and if you look at my second slide, it shows on the right side that during the pandemic it got even worse. We had two lockdowns, and during the second lockdown, the loneliness, the figures of loneliness through all age groups, they went up. Even so, people didn't get used to the lockdowns. They did not get used to lockdown. They felt the situation got even worse during the second lockdown. So that and during that time, loneliness was recognized by politics, by national, and politics asked for a national plan and for a national strategy, and that's why after our last elections, the three coalition parties agreed on several actions on regarding loneliness. So I think COVID-19 showed us what loneliness means, how many people, and it showed us that all age groups of society are affected by loneliness. And well, as I said, that was shown by us by COVID-19. So, and then you asked for what are the advantages of our way to step forward. I think Germany has a holistic and comprehensive approach, and Germany wants to tackle this problem for all age groups: young people, middle-aged people, and older people. And we want to tackle it with projects, low-threshold projects, and we think that this is the right way to go. And the difference, perhaps, to Japan and to the UK is we do not have a ministry tackling loneliness, but we want to involve all ministries on the federal level, which perhaps tackle the problem, and we want to get it together in our loneliness network. And as I said, it's holistic. We want to have the federal lender, and the community level integrated in the network, and stakeholders. So, as I said, we want to tackle the problem with a holistic and comprehensive approach by getting everybody together, by getting all the levels of the German government and society together. And then you ask for the main objectives. Our main objectives in our loneliness network are research, building a comprehensive network, and having a transfer and dissemination of knowledge among professionals and the public, with the aim of awareness raising and with the aim of destigmatization for the people who are affected by loneliness. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shubange-Fragen. Ms. Yuri, could you answer the questions we have?
네, 저는 한국어로.
I'm going to give an answer in Korean.
질문해 주신 부분 중에 이제 첫 번째가
So the first question
영국이나 일본과 같이 이제
was about
국가 정책 아젠다로 이렇게 정해서 추진해 나가는 것에 대해서
how do you see other countries' movement to address loneliness as a national policy agenda, such as the UK or Japan? Indeed, the UK and Japan recently established a ministry dedicated for loneliness and isolation, and I found it very interesting. And as I mentioned in my presentation, Korea is focusing on welfare policies for older persons and focus on improvement on such policies. And to that end, we carry out many projects. But we have not yet focused on loneliness and isolation, and we do not have enough policies to deal with those issues. So because of isolation, there could be many issues and risks, and we focus on reducing those risks and issues. But Japan and the UK are focusing on the issue of isolation itself, but we need to do more like those countries. So UK and Japan's cases are regarded as very best practices and interesting for us. So going forward, how to focus on isolation as a national agenda will be discussed, and I believe those two countries' cases are best practices and cases. And the second question is almost in line with the first question. We have many older persons' welfare policies, but even with those policies, suicidal rates and solitary death rate of older persons are really high, which I find very unfortunate and regretful. And to improve the situation, we are expanding welfare policies for older persons, and we remain committed to carrying out such policies. And as I give you the answer to the first question, we do not focus on isolation or loneliness itself, so we need to make some improvement. So going forward, we need to establish new policies that solely focuses on isolation and loneliness itself. So if we can do that, then we will be able to reduce and mitigate some high suicidal rates and solitary death rate of older persons, but it will require a lot of efforts. And recently, Ministry of Health and Welfare has made a lot of efforts, as well as local communities are making huge efforts as well, so that we can provide customized services for each and every local community. We need to consider characteristics of each local communities to give care services. And this is what we need to do going forward. And as for the last question, you asked how likely is the Korean government to introduce a loneliness ministry or division, but maybe I'm not able to say the correct answer when it comes to possibility or how likely it is, but we need to do more. So I'm not saying that we will establish a new ministry or division covering for loneliness, but we need to focus a bit more on loneliness and isolation itself, and to that end we need to design new policies, and we need to raise public awareness that loneliness is a serious societal issue, then even without ministries, we may and we can establish some divisions for dealing with
Thank you for your
loneliness.
response.
And
We have heard our questions and answers from both presenters. So as a final note, Dr. Schubanen Fragen, do you have any final remark?
Well, we came to the we come to the conclusion that loneliness is not only loneliness and isolation. It's not social isolation. It's not only a question or a problem for the older generation. It's a problem for all generations of a society, and this was shown by the corona pandemic. And I think you need a science-based, holistic approach, a comprehensive approach, and you have to raise awareness so that people who are affected by loneliness are not stigmatized, and you have to make sure that people can see that the problem loneliness can be tackled. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lee, do you have any final note to share?
해주실 수 있을까요?
저도 마찬가지로 고독, 고립이
I also believe that isolation and loneliness are not confined and limited to older persons. However, older persons are the most vulnerable groups to such risks. So, to reduce loneliness and isolation of older persons, we need to raise public awareness. And to that end, the government should be more committed and carry out more activities. So with that in mind, we will make sure to make more efforts.
As a final remark, I would like to wrap up this session's lesson as a moderator. I think it is very important to examine and continuously monitor the prevalence of loneliness and identify those exposed to a higher risk of loneliness for older adults as well as our individuals over the life course. It is also important to establish comprehensive policy agendas as they may increase the awareness of loneliness issues and motivate active participation and collaboration across national and local government, as well as non-profit and community organizations to tackle loneliness. Finally, I'd like to emphasize that it is important to promote social inclusion and connectedness for all others and others through diverse social participation opportunities and continuum of care in the community. Thank you, everyone, to join this session on addressing loneliness from the governmental perspective. Thank you both for presenting the important agendas in German and South Korea. And thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you. And would you please give them a big round of applause? Okay, thank you, all the presenters, Minister Masanobu, Director General von Schubanen-Fliegel, and Deputy Director Lee for your insightful presentation. And also my special thanks also go to Dr. Namgung for moderating these sessions. They share their effort to tackle the loneliness of older people, including their policies, network, collaboration, and project. I really appreciate your insight. Really thank you. And I think your presentation and discussions really gave us so much insight into how to resolve this issue. Thank you. And with that, we'll wrap up this session 3. And now, before we move on to the next session, we're going to have a break. And session 4 will resume at 4 p.m. Thank you, and see you then. Well, welcome back. It's time to resume the forum. I hope you relaxed during the break. And let's begin special session 4. Well, this is the final and special session of the 2022 ASEM Forum on Human Rights of Older Persons, Present and Future. And this session is led jointly with WHO under the topic of social isolation and loneliness among older people. And I'd like to introduce our moderator for this special session, Dr. Eun-ha Jang, Research Fellow at the Korean Women's Development Institute. Please welcome her with a big round of applause.
Good afternoon and good morning, everyone from various corners of the world. My name is Eun-ha Jang, as was introduced, a research fellow at the Korean Women's Development Institute. This is actually government institute under the Prime Minister's Office of South Korea, and we carry out many policy research dedicated on gender and family issues in Korea. And recently, our institute has also embarked on substantial amount of research on aging society, especially with the perspective of gender. So it is my great honor and pleasure to be invited to moderate this session, especially dedicate to know more about the WHO's report on this issue. Let me briefly introduce how I will be proceeding this session. We have 5 speakers from Asia and also from Europe. Each speaker, we have a main speaker who is from WHO, who will be introducing to us the last year's report on this subject. And we have 4 panelists. So each speaker will have around 20 minutes to present their findings and their research, followed by Q&A sessions. So we'll have after all people have spoke, then we'll have Q&A session, if that's okay with you. Let me briefly introduce who will be with us in this session. Dr. Christopher Micton from WHO, who was a lead author of the advocacy brief to discuss key findings. Dr. Michelle Lim, founding member of Ending Loneliness Together, Ms. Esther Zoloyomi, and Ms. Vernika Sandhu from the European Center for Social Welfare Policy and Research, Professor Eun-soo Choi from Korea University. I'll have a chance to introduce a little more in detail of each speaker later on. Okay, so without further ado, let me first give the mic to Dr. Micton. Let me just briefly introduce about him. He's our main speaker today. Currently, he's a specialist in international violence prevention and criminology with a specialization in forensic psychiatry. Now he's at the University of West of England, Bristol. He's working across criminology and public health. Before that, he worked in the Prevention of Violence Unit at the World Health Organization for almost a decade. Dr. Micton holds a PhD and MPhil from Cambridge University and his BA from McGill University, Canada. Now the mic is yours, Dr. Micton.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Just a correction, I'm at the World Health Organization at the moment. I'm no longer in Bristol. That was quite a few years ago. I'm in the Demographic Change and Healthy Aging Unit within the Department of the Social Determinants of Health at WHO. Okay, so let me start by sharing my screen. Is my screen shared? Can you see it?
Yes.
You can see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, good. And does it go forwards and backwards? It does. Okay, so we're ready to go. Let me just minimize everybody else because there we go. Okay, good. Ready to go. So first of all, I'd like to thank the ASEM Global Aging Center for inviting WHO to participate in this forum today. What I'll do in this brief presentation is first say a few words about what WHO has done in relation to social isolation and loneliness in the past, which isn't very much. Then I'll give you an overview of the advocacy brief, which is entitled Social Isolation and Loneliness Among Older People, which was published last summer in English and recently translated into Korean. And then I'll give you just a very brief overview of our current strategy at WHO to address social isolation and loneliness, which is made up of two main components. One is building up the evidence architecture, and the second is establishing a global commission on social connection. So, till 2021, WHO did not address this topic very much at all. I tried to find documents and I only found two short documents that were produced by the WHO European office on this issue, and that's pretty much it. However, with the COVID-19 pandemic and the attendant restrictions and lockdown measures, social isolation and loneliness really became a much more prominent topic. And even before the pandemic, there was an increased interest in social isolation and loneliness in a number of high-income countries, especially the UK and Japan, both of which have actually appointed a minister for loneliness. So in 2021, WHO decides to increase its activities in this area, and we start by focusing on older people within the context of the Decade of Healthy Aging, which WHO is leading with other UN agencies. Then more recently this year, we decided that we'd address social isolation and loneliness across all age groups, no longer just older people as well, but other age groups too. And the first step we took was to develop and publish this advocacy brief last summer. You can find it here at this link, the English version as well as the Korean version. This is the English version. This is the Korean translation, which the ASEM Global Aging Center very kindly translated for us into Korean. I'll give you a brief overview of this advocacy brief. I won't go into any detail. You can read the detail if you're interested. But it starts off by going over what we know about social isolation and loneliness among older people. And it starts by distinguishing between the concept of loneliness and that of social isolation. Loneliness basically refers to a subjective feeling, a painful subjective feeling, sometimes referred to as social pain, that results from a discrepancy between desired and actual social connection. Social isolation is an objective state, something that can be quantified, and it's a state of having a small network of kin and non-kin relationships, and thus few or infrequent interactions with others. The two haven't always been found to be highly correlated. It's possible to be socially isolated and not lonely, and lonely and not particularly socially isolated. So only a weak correlation has sometimes been found between these two constructs. The brief then goes on to look at the scale of the problem and finds that about 1 in 3 older people are lonely in different countries of the world. This isn't a global estimate. This is kind of a range based on studies in different countries, in Europe, in Latin America, in India, and China. Since we published this brief, there's been a very comprehensive meta-analysis on the prevalence of loneliness across 113 countries. And for older people, most of their data comes from European countries, but they found that it varied from a low of 5% of older people being lonely in Northern European countries to a high of about 21% in Eastern European countries. So they come to estimates that are lower than our 1 in 3. Brief goes on to look at the relationship between age and loneliness and concludes that it's not exactly clear what this relationship is. Some evidence suggests it's a U-shaped curve with high rates of loneliness among younger people, high rates among older people, lower rates in between, but other studies don't find that U-shaped curve. We look at gender and loneliness. We find that they're broadly similar levels of loneliness across gender, across the lifespan. And the brief also looks at recent trends in loneliness and concludes that it's unclear if global rates are going up or down. Some countries, rates of loneliness seem to be going up, like in China. Some European countries, they're more or less stable. In other countries, they seem to be going down. But it is clear that during the pandemic, with the attendant restrictions, the lockdown measures, etc., there was a slight increase in loneliness in many countries of the world. In terms of consequences, it's clear that social isolation and loneliness among older people are harmful. They shorten older people's lives. They damage their physical and mental health, and they reduce their quality of life. This figure shows a little bit more detail on the consequences. Social isolation and loneliness leads to an increased risk of mortality of about 30%, leads to an increased risk of health conditions such as cardiovascular disease, stroke, diabetes, depression, also leads to cognitive decline, leads to an increased risk of suicide as well as elder abuse, and results in economic costs due to increased healthcare costs and long-term care costs. In terms of what works to address social isolation and loneliness, many different interventions and strategies have been tried around the world, literally dozens or even hundreds of them. Many have shown promise, but we do not yet know which are the most effective and for whom, and we're not really currently in a position to make strong recommendations about which interventions to use. This figure here shows many different types of interventions organized according to the socio-ecological model. And you can see at the individual and relationship level, interventions are delivered either one-to-one or in groups. They can be delivered digitally or face-to-face, and they include things such as social skills training, befriending, and cognitive behavioral therapy. At the level of the community, different strategies have been implemented, including to improve infrastructures, such as improving transportation so people can meet more easily, and digital inclusion. And at the societal level, laws and policies have been implemented and enacted to try to reduce social isolation and loneliness. These include laws and policies addressing discrimination and marginalization, including ageism, and laws trying to reduce socioeconomic inequality that may have an impact on social isolation and loneliness as well. The advocacy brief identifies 7 areas that are really in need of strengthened research. I won't go over all of them, we just mention a few. The first is there's a need to develop a standard international instrument for measuring both social isolation and loneliness. At the moment, we don't have a standard, validated, cross-culturally validated, widely used instrument. Second area in need of strengthening is improving our understanding of prevalence, the distribution and trends in social isolation and loneliness. As I said, we don't really know what the current global trends are. Many people talk about an epidemic of loneliness in the world, but we don't really have the data to back that up. The third area in need of strengthening is to generate better evidence for effective interventions. As I said, we're not really in a position to make strong recommendations about interventions now, though many have been tried and many are promising. And the fourth area is to increase research in low and middle income countries. Till now, social isolation and loneliness have risen on the policy agenda, mainly in high-income countries and many low and middle-income countries in the world, where over 80% of the world's population live. We know a lot less about social isolation and loneliness, though we can presume, and there is some evidence to show, that it has the same harmful impact on health, and some of the prevalence studies show that it occurs at about the same prevalence. And the advocacy brief also lays out a three-pronged strategy to try to address social isolation and loneliness globally. And the first prong of this strategy is to create a coalition to increase political commitment globally. And this is actually being done. It was being started just as we published this by the Global Initiative on Loneliness and Connection. And Dr. Lim will be telling us, I think, a bit more about this in a minute. The second prong of this strategy is to improve research and evidence for what works. And the third is to scale up effective and cost-effective intervention. Now to say a few words about our current strategy at WHO to address social isolation and loneliness. Our current strategy is made up of two main components. The first is building up the evidence architecture for this, trying to strengthen the evidence, to gather together, to synthesize, and to strengthen the evidence to address this problem. And we're doing a number of things. We are producing two evidence and gap maps, one on digital interventions to reduce social isolation and loneliness, and the other on in-person interventions. We're doing this with the Campbell collaboration. These maps try to identify where there is good evidence, where the evidence is weaker, where there's no evidence, to try to guide policymakers and to guide research commissions. We've also started recently on developing guidelines, official WHO guidelines on interventions to reduce social isolation and loneliness across all age groups. This is quite a long, cumbersome process that takes about 2 or 3 years. And we go over all the evidence, we try to synthesize it, we commission new systematic reviews with a view to making very clear recommendations that ministries of health can then use in their efforts to reduce social isolation and loneliness. And then once this is done, we hope to gather all this together in an online evidence portal that will distill this evidence in a way that's accessible, intelligible, and can be used by policymakers and by decision makers. Second component of our current strategy is to establish a global commission on social connection. WHO has established a number of these commissions over the years, as well as other UN agencies have established such commissions. There is one as a commission on the social determinants of health in 2008, 2009, around then. So this would be a global commission on social connection, and its aim would be to increase the visibility and the political priority of the issue, and then to speed up the development and uptake of cost-effective solutions to address social isolation and loneliness. Be made up of high-level commissioners, 10 or 12 high-level commissioners, and a secretariat, which would sit at WHO and include other organizations and UN agencies, as well as an advisory board. And this commission will have 4 main outputs. One is a global index on social connection, which it would develop, which will help us monitor social connection around the world and track progress. The second main output of the commission would be a flagship commission report, which would make the case for increasing attention to this issue, and which would also make a number of evidence-based recommendations on how to go about tackling this issue. The third output would be have to do with advocacy, and be a feature film, try to raise awareness of this issue. And the last output of this commission would be the creation of what we're calling an intervention accelerator. The aim would be to bring together intervention developers, intervention evaluators, to try to speed up the development of cost-effective interventions and to speed up the uptake of these cost-effective interventions. So that's my brief overview of this advocacy brief and WHO's current strategies. Thank you for your attention. I'll stop sharing. There we are.
Thank you, Dr. Mitten, for that brief but very insightful introduction of your report. He actually walked us through some of the historical background, how WHO started to actually embark on this important issue. Also, some of the key points of his findings from the report, from this brief, and also the current two strategies that's being employed. And I can see that this is at the very starting stage, and it is really important that we, in order to have this agenda move forward, we really need some solid evidence-based data, statistics, so that we can actually persuade the government, the legal experts, and like national congressmen and etc. So thank you for bringing up this important points. So based on Dr. Mitten's speech, his presentation, we'll now go into our four panelists' presentation and discussion. So please allow me to introduce our second speaker from Australia, Dr. Michelle Lim. Let me briefly introduce her. Dr. Lim is the Chief Scientific Advisor and Chairperson for Ending Loneliness Together. This is an Australian network made up of universities and industry partners. She's the director also at the Social Health and Wellbeing Laboratory at Swinburne University of Technology, where she designs, delivers, and evaluates evidence-based digital interventions that reduces loneliness. She has done many research on this topic. And she has also co-founded the Global Initiative on Loneliness and Connection, and I believe she will be sharing with us some of her experiences on these research and also network experiences. Now, the floor is yours, Dr. Lim.
Thank you, Dr. Chang. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Thank you, first of all, for having me. I really feel very privileged to be on this panel today. And thank you, Chris, as well, for giving us a wonderful overview of I guess, the global state of affairs in loneliness and social isolation. As Dr. Zhang mentioned, my name is Dr. Michelle Lim. I'm the chair and scientific chair of an organization called Ending Loneliness Together. We're over here in Australia. And this national organization is really focused on addressing chronic loneliness across the lifespan, so both young and old. So we also started the Global Initiative on Loneliness and Connection in January 2021, at the time where this is an issue that came up for many countries, was increasingly acknowledged that many countries were kind of working on this issue by ourselves. And we didn't want it to be a lonely space. So we got together really to try to share this knowledge. And right now, we have about 12 member countries channeling into this issue and growing. So I will tell you what our focus is in a minute, but I just want to kind of just briefly say that what we're trying to do at the moment is really also collaborating with the World Health Organization on their commission to social connection or addressing loneliness and social isolation. We also are committed to collaborating with the EU Joint Research Center, who's doing some work on this space, and also Dr. Vivek Murthy, the 19th and 21st US Surgeon General. Many of you will know that this is also an area that's really critical and important to his interests. So what does the Global Initiative on Loneliness and Connection do? So the first thing to know is that we do have 3 areas that we try to focus our work on: awareness, collaboration, and frameworks, in order to end loneliness and promote connection. The awareness is really about raising global awareness through thought leadership and research dissemination. With collaboration, it's really around encouraging global knowledge sharing to improve impact and reach. And with frameworks, what we really want to do is to support national and systemic frameworks and strategies to promote connection and to end loneliness. So recently in May 2022, this year, we also generated a pretty comprehensive document that outlines around 6 position statements, and you can actually see that on our website. So the first is around social connection being essential to health and well-being. The second is around social isolation, loneliness, and other kind of constructs are actually distinct and each actually compromise well-being. Social well-being in general is really independent from related concepts. As our third, our fourth position statement is really indicating that a wide range of risk factors actually leave people vulnerable to loneliness and social isolation. Our fifth position statement is on how evidence-based solutions are needed to reduce social isolation and loneliness and to increase social connection. And our last is around addressing barriers to social connection in order to actually achieve effective action. And because there's a lot of confusion about what loneliness and social isolation is, and including lots of misconceptions within researchers ourselves, we also set up to, in these position statements, set up to actually define this issue, which is now being adopted by each of our member countries, about what we mean when we actually talk about loneliness. So loneliness in this case, as Chris mentioned before, is a subjective, unpleasant, or distressing feeling of a lack of connection to other people, along with a desire for more or more satisfying social relationships, compared to social isolation, which is around objectively having fewer social relationships, roles, group memberships, or infrequent social interactions. And we did define this solely because those misconceptions actually will lead to ineffective actions on the ground, and really being able to define them and also understand that there is the overlap. It's really mildly to moderately correlated across the lifespan, but don't actually mean the same thing. What is really critical for us to ensure that having a good understanding would then actually allow us to take the effective action for both. I want to kind of bring us back to the national agenda in Australia and kind of talk about a social recovery white paper that we've released just about a month ago. And this white paper was actually done at the request of our government because they do recognize that loneliness and social isolation were really critical issues that were coming up. But really in Australia, there's not really much of a strategy. In fact, it was really very much seen as a soft issue, perhaps a secondary outcome to mental health, or perhaps an issue that's only constrained to older adults, which we now know is something that happens to all of us, whether young and old. And so this white paper was really based on the findings of national leaders across our country. And I'm going to share with you a little bit about some of the findings, but also in thinking about these findings, we can kind of think about why and how to address this issue in older adults as well. So we have a really massive, large data set or epidemiological data set that we run over here, which is we call the HILDA data. And the HILDA data, captures 20,000 people per year for the last I think 20 years. And we actually established some very strict psychometric criteria about what loneliness is and what social isolation is based on this data set. And this is a 5-year cumulative prevalence from 2014 to 2018, so this pre-COVID data. And what we can see across the lifespan is that 34% of Australians met criteria for loneliness, but only about 17% met criteria for social isolation. Within those prevalence rates as well, what we have divided is actually looking at the difference between what we call episodic, so if you met criteria in 1 year, or if you met criteria repeatedly or 2 consecutive years. So we can see here that 21% of Australians reported what we call loneliness in the one time point, in the discrete time point, but 13% reported it in consecutive years. We know now from research that when you have more chronic experiences, it actually exacerbates our mortality and morbidity of other disorders. In fact, in older adults, if you have loneliness and also and you have more kind of persistent loneliness, is actually related to increased likelihood of an earlier death. What we also know now, which is really important, is that while these two constructs are separate, they actually work synergistically together in the in a very harmful way to actually also exacerbate our mortality. So researchers have noted independent pathways to disease. If you have loneliness versus social isolation, both are not good, but if you have both loneliness and social isolation, that's extremely detrimental than if you just had one or the other. So in thinking about this, our focus has always been thinking about not just reducing social isolation, but also what can we do to also take it one step further to also address loneliness, because we know now it's critical. So in terms of some of the recommendations that have come out of the social recovery white paper, and this is something I've mentioned earlier, is that lots of confusion, definitely in Australia. A lot of the interventions that are out there that are being sold as loneliness interventions are indeed social isolation interventions. So if you go back to the prevalence rate of what we are seeing in Australia, social isolation half that of loneliness, but yet all the funding solely goes to interventions in social isolation. And by that, I mean a lot of money, and we're talking about, you know, $60 to $100 million being put into programs where, you know, community organizations would visit, say, an older person in their home, but they may visit them for 2 minutes, and that would be considered a loneliness intervention. And what we're really advocating is that it needs to go beyond that 2-minute visit, that we actually need to not just increase the access or opportunities to other people, interaction of the older person, but we also need to think about how we can increase the quality of the interaction. So for example, one way that we could do that, for example, is to try to keep the volunteer who does these visits the same, to ensure that the outputs or the KPIs, as we call it, of the program is not just the number of visits, but the quality of the interaction as well. So really focusing on both. Those sorts of things are really, really important. So in Australia, definitely what we see is lots and lots of interventions saying that they are loneliness interventions, but really they don't do much to actually reduce loneliness, but they actually really, in fact, reduce social isolation. So that's something that we are recommending in terms of, you know, changing the way we think about this issue. The other issue that we have is that most people would, you know, advocate that their intervention is the best and the only one that works. But we know now that actually there is no one size fits all, and this is really based back on the complexity of social needs and the diversity of people and even the resources that we have access to. So I think Chris mentioned the socio-ecological model, and this is very much a multi-layer, comprehensive approach. We know that, for example, loneliness in particular is multifaceted. It's not really a consequence of one factor. Often it could be a consequence of many factors. And while loneliness, for example, is an innate signal for us to connect, and it's normal to feel lonely at different times in our lives, what happens though is that our loneliness is maintained through kind of more systemic barriers. For example, the communities that we live in, that we see huge effects with, you know, neighborhood deprivation, income levels, not enough green spaces in our neighborhoods that actually are associated with higher levels of loneliness. We know that certain policies around, for example, aged care policies that we don't have enough age-friendly communities being built. We don't have policies around how we can ensure the quality of those aged care visits actually are coded as opposed to just visits. We don't actually also have many interventions even around trying to educate our healthcare or aged care practitioners about what loneliness is and is not, or what social isolation is and is not. And also educating, again, on the kind of more relationship level, the friends, families, people you work with, and also the individual themselves. There's a lot of shame and stigma with feeling lonely in older adults. There's also generational differences in how they conceptualize it. Often when we speak to older adults, they are ashamed to say that they are lonely, and are more likely to deny it when you use the word lonely because of that stigma that kind of still persists. So in thinking about this issue, we need to think about different kinds of solutions that can go across these levels, and they're both direct and indirect solutions. And worryingly, and kind of mirroring what Chris has said before, the evidence-based solutions are rarely implemented at scale. So what we see is little pockets of interventions that work, and really it's perhaps linked to the lack of funding. So we see small pots of interventions working at a local level, but they're rarely implemented on a much larger community level. And the third recommendation that we really have around how we can actually recover from this pandemic is that we need to think of addressing loneliness in particular, both within the prevention space and the intervention space. So we know from the literature already that loneliness, for example, is a poor antecedent to high levels of depression, social anxiety, and paranoia across a 6-month period in the general population. What we are also seeing here is loneliness is associated with high levels of suicide, especially in older men. And this is a huge worry that, in fact, suicide prevention is a massive topic over here in Australia, and we're trying to think about what we can do to address loneliness and social isolation to prevent suicide. But also some emerging literature about how we can actually address loneliness and social isolation to facilitate recovery from illness, to slow down more negative effects on our health, like cognitive decline, and very important to government as well, to reduce the impact of health usage on our services, because we know it's a huge economic burden. From memory, we know that for every person in Australia that gets lonely, it costs the government around $1,565, and it's equating around $2.7 billion a year over here in Australia. So based on our 3 recommendations, we also have 4 actions, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but briefly I'll mention that what we are interested in doing is really building a social connection framework that can actually go across cultures, across ages, across sectors. Now that's something that's not available right now within Australia. I'm going to be focusing on Action 2 in a brief minute. So Action 2 is around strengthening our workforce capacity. Action 3 is really important, which is very similar to the global initiative in Loneliness and Connections, around empowering community and kind of building awareness in a community about how we can actually help people who are lonely in a dignified, respectful, and meaningful way, in ways that actually they find useful. Again, just going back to the stigma of loneliness, what that actually means is that people are underreporting, people feel very disrespected when you kind of have these conversations that don't actually understand or honor the lived experience of someone who's lonely. It's really important for us to kind of teach our community words and language and strategies to actually talk about this issue without further stigmatization of the issue. And Action 4, again, fueling Australian-based research all the way from prevention to intervention, but also things like knowledge translation is really critical and lacking. I will focus, and this is one of my final slides, really around the Action 2, and I think this is something that is lacking in many countries, not just Australia, but that we really need to think about how we can strengthen our workforce at the moment in terms of trying to address this issue. So this, for older adults, for example, could be in aged care and the health workforce. Practitioners on the ground, for example, don't actually know how to help, who to help. And some of the things go back to the lack of measurement. Valid and reliable measures for loneliness and social isolation should be used. We find that people are underreporting. So when we do ask direct questions of, are you lonely? Because of the stigma of loneliness, what you get is underreporting, especially in older men, is something that we see over here. So again, what can we do as well to establish and develop kind of national guidelines and recommendations? And in doing that, we really need to co-design not just the person who is lonely, but also across age and health practitioners, again, about how we talk about these things. Now, there's also a huge issue around being culturally sensitive. Australia, has, I think 1 in 2 Australians are not born in Australia. And the different cultural groups that might interpret the questions that we ask and what loneliness is and their beliefs about who should be helping is also all those factors are going to be, things that we need to really uncover and clarify before we actually make a huge difference. So thank you very much. I'm going to end there, and I will move on to my next panel discussant.
Wow, thank you so much for this extensive explanation and sharing of your research and also your frontline experiences. I was especially struck by your definition, a clear definition of loneliness and social isolation. Actually, in Korea, we still don't use this term loneliness. And social isolation, yes, more and more we started to hear about this social isolation, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. Now we are very familiar with this term, but not loneliness. And it was really enlightening to while hearing your presentation, and also I really was also very impressed by some of the gender implications. You mentioned about some higher propensity of older men in some instances, so maybe I'm getting more curious about this issue. So thank you so much. Okay. Please jot down, people online, if you have any questions, comments, more specific questions that you want to address to these speakers as we go along. Let me move on to our third and fourth presenters who will be actually sharing their time to, I think they will be dividing some of their presentations. Let me introduce both of them right now at this moment. Ms. Esther Zoloyomi, she's a researcher at the European Center for Social Welfare Policy and Research in Vienna. She has 15 years of professional experience in comparative research on income inequality, poverty, social inclusion, aging, and gender. She participated in many research and consultancy projects. From 2008 to 2012, she was the coordinator of a research project on mainstreaming aging indicators across the UN European region. And she was part of the research team of the Active Aging Index. So she is the specialist in this issue. We have another, the next presenter is from the same institute, I believe, Ms. Veronica Sandu. She's an associated expert with the European Center for Social Welfare Policy and Research, the same institute. She's a social protection expert with more than 15 years of working experience. She's engaged in research projects that looks into different aspects of support to vulnerable groups, including older population. These two experts will be sharing their time, and I believe Ms. Sandu will be speaking first on their research, findings, and experiences. Ms. Sandu, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having us. I will share my screen and then, without further ado, we start the presentation. I hope you can see it clearly on your screen. So today with my colleague Esther Zodiomi, we will be presenting the results of a study we did on social isolation and loneliness among older people in Europe. It was a study commissioned by INSERSO Institute in Spain, and I will have to also say that we have a third author, Kai Leistring. I'm trying to move the slides. Just a second. Small problem with moving my slides. I'm really sorry for this. I think I'll just stop sharing and reshare it. I'm really sorry. Oh. I have an issue of changing my slides, and I truly don't know why. Esther, maybe you will try sharing.
May I propose then one of the organizers share the slide, and then we can just say when the next slide is should be moved.
Okay, let me check with the. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry for this. These technical things happen. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Can we please then go to the next slide? So an overview of our presentation, shortly about the scope, concepts, and methods of the study, then factors associated with loneliness and social isolation in later life, and impact of loneliness and social isolation. This would be the results of our desk research. Loneliness and social isolation among older persons in Europe, figures coming from the 2 European surveys, and then a mapping of policy measures and interventions to prevent and diminish these 2 phenomena. And we will finalize with our conclusions. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the scope of the study was to actually look at prevalence in European comparative perspective on loneliness and social isolation, to have a synthesis of factors contributing to loneliness and social isolation as well, then to identify policy solution to combat and prevent these 2 phenomena. It's very important to say that we also differentiated between the 2 main concepts, loneliness and social isolation. I will not stop here to present our approach because it's very similar to what Dr. Micton and Dr. Lim presented. It's very important for, as Dr. Lim also pointed out, for policy solution to have a clear understanding that these are 2 different phenomena. So on the methods, literature review, data analysis based on the European Quality of Life Survey and the European Social Survey, then identification of good practice examples via expert, and extensive desk research. Next slide, please. So this is a figure that illustrates factors associated with social isolation and loneliness in later life. We adapted it from Clark and McDougall. And what we liked about this one, it's that it shows and it clusters very well these factors. It shows the complexity of it. And as you can see, it's a typology similar to what Dr. Micton presented. So we looked at factors at individual level, community level, societal factors. We know that places can influence social isolation and loneliness. For sure, people influence social isolation and loneliness. The socioeconomic drivers could be influencing as well. And all of these factors vary across the lifetime course, as Dr. Lim pointed out. So maybe we'll have now a zoom in into a few of these typologies. Next slide, please. So when we looked at these factors, our perspective was more to provide a comprehensive understanding to the policy makers on what to consider when designing measures to prevent and diminish these two phenomena. So we saw from the desk research that age is a factor for sure. We knew that while embarking on the analysis. And also, as Dr. Micton showed, age has a U-shaped relationship to loneliness and isolation. What we saw from the existing research is that people feel lonelier around 60 years old. And this is mainly related to retirement. So when they retire, they lose connection, they lose social network, and then they slowly rebuild this. So the U-shape curve goes back and then goes up again around 80 years old when people lose mobility, they lose in health and also in social connection. Gender is also an aspect that should be carefully considered while designing policy measures. Women and men perceive, feel, and cope with social isolation and loneliness quite differently, and it's very important to consider that when designing measures, right? Outreach should be different, and approach should be quite different or tailored to particularities of gender. Minority, ethnicity, and migration are also variables that come very strongly now within the aging Europe. This is also important to consider for outreach, design, and implementation of measures to combat and prevent social isolation and loneliness in later life. As was already mentioned by the previous speakers, poor physical and mental health, impaired mobility, disability, sensory impairments, all factors that could lead to isolation and loneliness in later life, but also very important factors to consider when we design interventions, right? We have to consider limitation of these people to access social network, to interact, to physical mobility of these people, very, very important. So marital status, like being a widower or being a carer of, or the size of personal social network, all important factors when we speak about isolated and lonely older people in Europe, especially being a carer. That's a very high issue on the agenda, and support and a system for the carers are being designed. And it's important also to consider isolation and loneliness while designing support measures for carers. Next slide, please. So on the community factors, also already mentioned, the neighborhood characteristics are very importantly when we talk about measures to support social interaction of older people. Safety, very important. Access to services and amenities, availability of recreational areas, as well as social activities, cultural activities. The distance and access to safe and affordable means of transportation, also very important to consider while designing policy for all the population. And then lack of access to communication technology, internet and social media, also a new tool and also a useful tool while designing measures and implement these measures. We will see later on how technologies are used in prevention and diminishing policies. Thank you. Next slide, please. And then societal factors, of course, broader phenomena that influence social isolation and loneliness in later life. As also mentioned, material deprivation, like the income level, very important. People that have more material financial opportunities, they interact more. That's quite intuitive. The social protection and pension country profiles also influence, and of course it's related to what I said above about the income level, the overall population aging, the very concerning increasing number of single resident households in Europe, factors that would lead to and need to be considered in combating policies and measures, the great geographical mobility that we have in Europe, and we all are grateful for it, but then this could cause parents left behind by children that move freely inside Europe. Emigration, urbanization, all of this should be considered at national level while designing and looking at measures to prevent and combat isolation and loneliness in later life. Next slide, please. I would truly not stop or look in depth on the impact of social isolation and loneliness on all the people. My previous speakers very nicely presented that. It's very important to tackle this issue, and we all, I think, acknowledge and know that. I will just read a quote from Capoccio et al., one of the research studies that we consider in our desk research, like weak social connections carry a health risk that is more harmful than not exercising and twice as harmful as obesity. I think it's very clear that we need these policies. We have to think in advance. We have to think about prevention. In one of the reports, there was also a quote saying that loneliness and social isolation in later life is caused by 20 years of decisions and context. So quite important to consider that. And, you know, also while talking about all the people, measures to support social integration and reduce loneliness in other people, we have to look at small things like how we help those in residential care, how we help those in nursing care, how we prevent institutionalization, how we prevent hospitalization, and all of those issues. With that, I will stop. I will kindly ask to move to the next slides, and I will give the floor to my colleague Esther.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So for our studies, we also, basically the main idea was also to look at, from a comparative perspective, building on existing survey data in Europe on the prevalence rates of loneliness. And as you can see, loneliness affects a significant share of all the populations in Europe. And this is pre-COVID data, so this was already the case before the COVID-19 pandemic. And so in the European Union, on average, 18%, or almost 1 in every 5 older citizens aged 65 or older, reported to feel frequently lonely. And frequent loneliness is defined as when respondents reported that they felt lonely all or almost all of the time, or more than half of the time. And as we can see, the prevalence of loneliness varies greatly across the countries. It tends to be more common among older people, especially in Eastern Europe, but also in Southern Europe, whereas older people in Northern European countries appear to be much less affected. There has been a number of explanations put forward to explain this cross-national variation in the level of loneliness. Differences in social norms, cultural values concerning family obligations and relationships seem to play an important role. And for instance, in Eastern and Southern Europe, where countries are characterized by traditionally strong family ties, older adults might be more prone to experience loneliness with the weakening of such ties, and when support from their adult children or other family members are not forthcoming. Next slide, please. Studies also, as was mentioned before, consistently show that loneliness and social isolation are particularly affects the oldest old. And this has been closely linked to old age factors, mainly limitations in health, declining health, mobility limitations, but also life cycle changes, such as mentioned before, retirement or becoming a carer, as well as age-related losses, the death of a spouse, friends, other family members, and the growing difficulties of replacing these relationships. Next slide, please. Another decisive factor is living arrangements. Older people who live alone are significantly more likely to report feeling frequently lonely compared to those who share their household with at least one other person. And given that there is already a relatively large share of the European older population that lives alone, in many countries this concerns over 1/3 of older people already, and that the number of single elderly households is increasing also. So loneliness is definitely an issue, and living arrangement is definitely a factor that deserves particular attention. Next slide, please. Research also shows that loneliness is greatly influenced by the size of personal social networks and the quantity and quality of social contact. And this is also confirmed by survey data from Europe. In Europe, more than 1 in every 10 older persons reported in 2018 that they met socially with friends or family less than once a month or never. And because this indicator measures contacts outside the household, the lack of social contact is expected to affect older people living alone even more. The quality of social relationships, specifically the lack of emotional support, is another salient issue we think should be considered. While in most of the surveyed countries in Europe, people tend to have someone with whom they can talk about personal or intimate issues. In some countries, over 15% of older people in 2018 stated that they had no one to rely on for emotional support. And this is important because those who report to having people with whom they have a close, confiding relationship, on average, have a lower likelihood of experiencing loneliness. And of course, the lack of social connections and interactions and emotional support was amplified with the onset of the COVID pandemic as a result of pandemic-induced lockdowns and mobility restrictions, and the negative implications of this for mental and emotional well-being, including loneliness, have been relatively well documented by data collected during the pandemic, including through online European surveys. Next slide, please. So in April-May 2020, when most of Europe was in first lockdown, 1/4 of older people reported to be affected by loneliness, which then decreased as European economies and societies were gradually reopening, only to increase again almost a year on as countries were still dealing with various levels of lockdown. And it's important to note that loneliness during the pandemic had not been an experience confined to older people alone. And it had indeed a large impact also on other age groups, as you can see, especially younger people. And just before handing over again to Veronica, who will continue, I just want to highlight some limitations also regarding data availability on loneliness in Europe. So while in Europe is a region that is relatively well covered by large comparative surveys that also allows to study this phenomenon from a cross-country perspective, the data mainly cover European Union countries. And so there remains also disparities in terms of data on loneliness when considering the broader European region. There is also a need for studies that can analyze long-term trends of loneliness across the life course. And such longitudinal data that was already presented by Dr. Lim Hilda in Australia is particularly important to identify and to account for factors especially associated with the onset of loneliness, which can then inform policies and also help developing effective interventions in this regard. And now I hand over to my colleague who will continue the presentation.
Thank you. So on the following slide, as you can see, it's a sort of a mapping that we did to truly see what is available out there in terms of policies, measures, and interventions to prevent and reduce isolation and loneliness of all the population. We also group them in a logical way, which ties very well with the factors. So we have individual support, which is one-to-one. We have group settings, and we have community level interventions. There are various measures, actions, and interventions which are done. They more or less tackle the same thing, like improve social skills, expand the social network, improve the social connection, counseling, and therapy. This is more or less what is happening at the one-to-one support. You can see the measures in a way described in the first column of the table. On the group settings, I guess it's the philosophy of the measures and intervention are clear. They try to bring together people that have the common characteristics that have in a way a joint interest, where they can support mutually one another. That's very important as well, because with some particular groups, outreach and support is particularly difficult. And this it's true for people that go through an illness, a divorce, bereavement, for carers, for instance. And then community level support. This is mobilizing volunteer work and making communities in general more age-friendly and more age-acceptant. We have few examples of good practices in this regard for each of the clusters. You will find the details of these practices in our report and in the policy brief, which is published on our institution website. But I would just like to present more in depth two of these policies. Next slide, please. Thank you. So one of those is the quite well known, I guess, in Europe, French national program called nicely Mona Lisa, which is abbreviation from Mobilisation nationale contre l'isolement des âgés. It was launched in 2013 and then scaled up in 2017. Of course, the goal is to reduce isolation and loneliness of all the people across the country. How? They put in place this citizen teams, which are a group of professional and volunteers that interact, socialize, work, provide services and support to all the people. There are various things that they do together. What is interesting in this program, that they enhance individual connections and collective connections. What is also interesting is that the citizen teams, they help each other, they communicate one with another, and they scale up what they know that already works at smaller level. So they have this national committee to transfer local outputs into national policy and to pilot different activities and different initiatives. And this proves a good filter to see what works and what doesn't. So I guess today they have almost 300 citizen teams across France and still working and still expanding. Thank you. Next slide, please. The second one, it's a national program in the UK, the Link Age. As you all know, UK is quite advanced in putting in place measures and policies to prevent and diminish isolation and loneliness, including for all the population. So this was also the scope of this particular intervention. What is interesting and why we brought it up, it's by design, this measure brings the skills, experience, and expertise of all the people into the light. So they share all of this with the younger peers, with the old peers. So this is in a way putting value on the expertise and experience all the people have. It's a one-to-one support. It's also a group support, and it also has elements of wider community engagement. I also think that Dr. Lin mentioned at some point that for a good intervention, all these factors should be considered and measures should come together for a truthful impact. So what they did, they established these community hubs managed by a local advisory board. It's just a space where people can meaningful interact, share experience, transfer skills, and also acquire skills. All the people, for instance, are being taught how to use technology, apps, and social media. They do many activities for people of 55 plus age cohort, and they, in a way, have three separate or distinct initiatives. The Link Age ACE one, which is the main one, which is the skills sharing. The Link Age Plus, which is more or less the same program but implemented in the residential facilities, and the talking tables, which, as the name shows, it's in a way the socializing and bringing together a measure. So there is evidence on this program that it helps people to feel more connected, improves their well-being, and pushes them to be more active and communicate more. It was an internal evaluation done on this, so there is really no external evaluation that will show us truthful impact, but there is some evidence on good impact. They also had a separate initiative during the COVID-19 pandemic to support older people to stay connected and cope with the lockdown. Next slide, please.
Ms. Sandhu, can you wrap up like in 2 minutes?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. We have the concluding remarks. So also a question that was raised already today, what works? Evidence on effectiveness of the intervention. It's in short supply, truly. So we collected a lot of measures and policies and activities and interesting initiatives, but it's very, very little out there on what is cost effective, what is impactful. Most interventions are complex and they combine different elements, activities, and type of support. What really works are the measures that target specific subgroups, right? Like men, which are widowed men, for instance, or carers, or people that go through an illness. If it's very well targeted with a very clear outreach plan, then this shows better results than very generic initiatives. So the existing reviews identified some common characteristics of what works. First, adaptability to the specific context, a community development approach, activities to support active engagement and active participation, as I already mentioned, very well-defined target population, and having a theoretical framework that supports the measure and the initiative. And our concluding slide, please. So, need for greater recognition of social isolation and loneliness. I guess it's a conclusion throughout all the presentations from today's panel. National level, regional level, local level should come together to support older people to feel less isolated and lonely. At the local level, it needs to be created opportunities for more social exchange, to support the informal network and formalize some activities, to provide safe spaces for interaction and have very well prepared personnel to support these measures and action, enhancing the knowledge base on social isolation and loneliness. More research, more data, more evidence is needed. We as researchers are very much in favor of an evidence portal that Dr. Micton presented. And of course, raising public awareness. It should be on the agenda strongly on all European countries, and my today's conclusion may be beyond. So policymakers will understand the detrimental effects of loneliness and social isolation on each individual, on a community, on society at large. And we should address stigma associated with loneliness. That will help us research it more, and that will help us design better tailored support measures. I will just quickly invite Esther maybe to add if she wants on the conclusions. If not, that was all from our side.
Sorry, no, I have nothing to add. We are also, I think, crunch. We have a time crunch here, so we should finish.
Thank you so much. So details in the report and in the policy brief that you can find on our website.
Wow, thank you so much for that quite in-depth, extensive, rigorous policy research results done by these two experts from Europe. Actually, I felt like I was reading more of a policy report from my institute because this is very much policy oriented, and you came up actually with the specific measures, intervention measures, at the very end. So I think this is a very nice layout where Dr. Lim has introduced us more academic, more knowledge, more fundamental concepts about these issues and how these academics actually and policymakers network together in this issue at the global level and also at the national level. And then we have some policy experts giving us, some more detailed results on this report, how they have comparatively actually among the European countries. So more concrete things that's going on actually based on our first speaker's broad overview on this social isolation and loneliness issue. Okay, we have our last panelist, but not the least, Professor Eun-Soo Choi from Korea University. Let me briefly introduce her. Professor Choi is Associate Professor at the School of Psychology at Korea University, Seoul, which is one of the very prominent universities in Korea. She is interested in studying how cultural context shape people's emotional, cognitive, and behavioral processes. Currently, she's working on the interactions of diverse groups in South Korea, including older persons. So, Professor Choi, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay and see the screen? All right. Okay. Hi, my name is Eun-Soo Choi, and thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor to be a part of such an important event. But before I begin, I would just like to say that I am not an expert on aging or policy for older adults. I'm a social psychologist by training, and I have conducted research on well-being with mostly younger adult population because that's who I can get to recruit on campus. But in the process, luckily for me, I got to work with other collaborators on older adult populations and published some works recently, and that's how I got to connect with ASEM Global Aging Center. So the things that I would be talking about today is more of a broad approach to understanding well-being of older adults, focusing on the issues of social isolation and loneliness. And I will do this by putting this age group into a developmental context. So, which means I will look at the role of these social relationships and loneliness across different age groups and how they may differ and what are the implications of it. I'm afraid that some of the materials that I prepared overlaps with other speakers, so I'll try to skip that part as much as I can so as not to bore the audience. So I think I may be able to end the presentation sooner than planned, which I think helps in this situation. So just to start off with a really a common sense that we all agree, humans are social animals. We as a species have this fundamental motivation to bond with other people because that was crucial for our survival in our evolutionary history. So the fact that this need to belong or to need to be connected is so fundamental to humans shows when people are deprived of it. So when people experience social rejection or social exclusion, people say that they are heartbroken or they feel hurt. And this is not a figurative expression. People literally feel physical pain when they are socially isolated. So this is the brain areas that are typically involved in physical pain, but are also activated when people are rejected by others. So at the brain level, a pain from a toothache and a pain from a heartbreak is pretty much the same. So there's also a famous study done by Nathan DeWall back in 2010, in which he showed that people taking the Tylenol reported reduced distress in response to social rejection, which also indicates that social pain is very real. And there have been, substantial number of studies on the effects of social isolation over the past 40 years or so. And research has a solid findings that social isolation is associated with increased mortality. And these are very much covered in the media as well. Some researchers argue that the risk of being lonely is comparable to the risk of smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. And this is all very much covered previously by Dr. Christopher, I forgot the last name, Micton, sorry, Dr. Micton and Dr. Lim and others. So I'm just going to briefly mention. So these are all of the negative associates of social isolation or loneliness. There's cost to physical health, and most notably regarding the coronary artery disease. And of course, social isolation has also been found to risk factors for mental health issues, most notably depression. And there's also some indications that there's a link to neurocognitive impairment like dementia. And of course, these are all associated with decreased quality of life, such as low satisfaction with life, unhappiness, and negative emotions. So the psychologists are interested in the mechanisms that underlie these kind of connections. So what might be underlying this relationship between loneliness and these negative outcomes? And researchers have documented a couple of significant mediating factors that account for such effects. And I think this is important for policy perspective because you can then identify the exact the processes by which you can intervene. First, social relationships has some effect on health behavior. Specifically, relationships can serve as a positive pressure for people to engage in healthy behaviors. So people who have more social support, they're more likely to have better sleep quality because they go to bed on time. They are more likely to engage in greater physical activity and engage in less smoking, for instance. And the second pathway is through psychological mediators, namely stress, because this feelings of loneliness is very much associated with the perception of being rejected by others, which is inevitably linked to a sense of worthlessness, right? It's that low self-esteem. So lonely individuals are stressed out to begin with. And also they are at a disadvantage in times of stressful events, during a stressful event, because they have fewer social relationships that they can rely on for guidance and help. And also finally, there is this direct cycle starting from the feelings of distress of loneliness to elevations in sympathetic nervous system, the HPA system as well. So there's a strong evidence that low social support and loneliness are linked to both acute and chronic elevations in blood pressure, higher inflammation markers, even the gene expressions. Well, so one thing that is noteworthy by reviewing this literature is that most of these studies on loneliness and its adverse effect on health outcomes are from studies on older people, which is the focus of our time here. But I just wanted to mention that there are fewer research on the effect of loneliness for younger people. And this is probably because there is greater public awareness of loneliness in older adults, right? When we hear the word lonely, we often think about an old man sitting on a bench by himself. And another reason that I think is behind this may have to do with our interchangeable use of the term social isolation and loneliness, which a lot of the speakers have already talked about. So it's true that older adults are more socially isolated than younger adults, but this does not necessarily mean that they are lonelier. So I wanted to just briefly touch on the distinctions between social isolation and loneliness, but these are well covered by the previous speakers. I'm just going to mention that these are very different indicators, and one is objective and the other is more of a subjective perception. And although the social isolation and loneliness are related, the correlation is far from perfect, right? And so when it comes to the number of social relationships, younger adults definitely have greater social connections and bigger social network size, but the data consistently show that the younger adults were actually the lonelier age group compared to the older adults. So just to kind of briefly show you the data on from the European countries and the Western part of the world mainly. So this is the data on the frequency of loneliness reported by British people by age groups. As you can see, the proportion of people who reported that they are lonely is larger for younger people than for older adults. In the US data too, this is more of an upper age range here. So looking at the data from the 50s and up, there's a clear trend where you find the middle-aged adults, those in their 50s and 60s, are lonelier than older adults in their 70s. So younger adults are actually lonelier than older adults, which may come as a surprise for many. In fact, the field of psychology for a long time has been dominated by this disengagement theory, which many of you will be familiar. This postulate that toward the end of people's lives, they pull away from the society in preparation for death, and that this theory posits that old age is characterized by loss and emotional disturbances, unlike younger generations. But beginning in the 80s and into the 90s, studies after studies contradicted this core assumption that older people are distressed. So except for dementia, older adults show less psychopathology of all forms than their middle-aged and younger counterparts. And actually, they report better control over their emotions and experience more positive emotions. And I just wanted to focus on the strength of these older adults and how we can capitalize on it. So just to show you the mechanism for why older adults fare better emotionally than younger adults. So I believe that one of the most influential theories in psychological research regarding this age paradox is called socio-emotional selectivity theory, proposed by Laura Carstensen. So SST. So the fundamental idea behind socio-emotional selectivity theory is that humans have the fundamental awareness of the passage of time. And this perception of this time perception provides a change in context in which primary goals people pursue vary. So specifically, when individuals perceive that their time left in life is long, right, which is what young adults would perceive, they prioritize goals that are preparatory, such as acquiring new knowledge, making new friends, exploring new things. However, as time horizons grow shorter, which would apply for older adults, emotional goals become more important, such as feeling satisfied, being socially connected, feeling purpose and meaning of life. So when you feel that time is limited, you try to be selective in choosing the activities to do, in choosing the people that you meet, and with a focus on savoring the experiences that happen in the moment when they occur. So over the years, as people get older, they prefer to be with a close friend who are emotionally significant rather than with some other exciting people that they don't know much about. So based on the SST, the reason why older adults have smaller social network size than younger adults is not because of deaths of their family members or their friends or a lack of social opportunities. It's because they selectively reduce and intentionally reduce social interactions with non-significant peripheral relationships and focus more on and invest in close relationships. And importantly, emotional closeness with these smaller number of close others of older adults increase over time. So even though they have smaller network size than younger adults, they actually enjoy more satisfying relationships. So this partly explains why older adults are not only less lonely than younger adults, but also they're actually happier than them. So we have seen and heard about this U-shaped relationship between age and well-being. So this, in the well-being literature, this is a pretty much well-established finding across different cultural backgrounds. The finding is that individuals sort of gradually become unhappier after their 18th birthday and reach the lowest point around 45 or 50, and then followed by a gradual upturn in old age. So this is a typical U-shape that you see in this relationship. This graph you're seeing is actually based on a large data set of over 10,000 Koreans between the ages 14 and 75. And you can see that consistent with previous research that was mostly done in the Western culture, there's a U-shaped relationship between age and well-being here as well. So here, the data is a little bit younger than so the average age is only 29, so you have to take that into account. But the people in their 30s are the least satisfied with their life, and older adults are happier than these younger people. But what I wanted to focus on in this talk was that it wasn't that all older adults were happier than younger adults. It was actually only those who were agreeable, who had the personality trait of agreeableness, who were happier than their younger counterpart. So this is the results that I visualized. So here you can see that those older adults who fare better than their younger counterparts are the ones who are agreeable, which is this purple line here. And those older adults who are not agreeable, which is indicated by the red line, were actually less satisfied with their life than those who are younger. So agreeableness is this personality trait that is important for maintaining social relationships, right? People who are agreeable, they're more likely to be cooperative, forgiving, less quarrelsome, and accepting, which are all features that help fostering positive relationship with others. So the fact that this personality trait becomes particularly beneficial for older adults suggests that interpersonal relationships are more critical for older adults' well-being than for younger adults. So, just linking this back to the socio-emotional selectivity theory, there are reasons to believe that being socially connected may have greater impact on the well-being of older adults than for younger adults. As we have seen in the SSST, the intrinsic goals become more important as people get older. And one of the most important source of fulfilling such an intrinsic goal is gratifying relationships. So naturally, being connected and getting support from close people should be especially important for these individuals. And secondly, this is a hypothesis, but social support is particularly valuable in times of stress. So being old is inevitably accompanied by a range of stressors. They're physically frail, they have limited financial means. So within the circumstances, social resources become more crucial for buffering against life stressors. So indeed, this was the case for Korean older adults as well. So I'm going to show you some of the analysis that I did with my colleagues with Korean adults living in Seoul. And we found that these two theories were supportive. So basically, what we looked at is whether the peoples, actually these are adults from the 20s and 60s, so we were able to look at these relationships between loneliness and well-being measures across different age groups. And I'm just going to show you the results here. So as you can see from this result, we found that feelings of loneliness was more detrimental for older adults than for younger adults, right? So as you can see, the slope is steeper for older adults here. And on the right, this is looking at the perceived social support. So the perception of how much you have close others that you can rely on. Perceived social support predicted reduced physical symptoms and chronic health conditions only for older adults, but not for the younger adults. So this was consistent with what would be predicted by socio-emotional selectivity theory and stress response hypothesis. So being connected with others and feeling that they are being supported was especially important for older than younger adults. I believe these are all good news for policymakers because these results indicate that preventing and alleviating social isolation and loneliness should be especially effective for this age group. I just wanted to end this talk by introducing, sharing you with the final study that I did with my colleagues, which gives us some possible avenue by which older adults' loneliness can be addressed. So what we did is we used a data set called Korean Retirement and Income Study, and we looked at whether social participation protects older adults against developing depressive symptoms, which is one of the #1 causes for suicide among older adults. So by social participation, we mean a person's involvement in activities that provide interactions with people outside the home setting, so in the society or in the community. So ranging from social activity like hobby club or community circle, economic activity, both paid or unpaid, volunteer work and donation as well. And in this study, we were able to show that this is irrespective, regardless of older adults' marital status or their residential status, whether they're living by themselves or not. Those who participated in these activities more were less likely to develop depressive symptoms. I just wanted to share this study because I think it was important in that this study showed that even though these relationships in these social settings are not typically considered as strong as ties with families or relatives, they can still serve as social networks that are supportive and emotionally fulfilling. So this was somewhat different from what SST would predict, which emphasized the importance of long-standing, close-knit social relationships for older people's well-being. But the present study shows that forming relatively novel relationships at old age through diverse social groups is not only possible, but also may be a very effective method to increase a sense of connectedness among older adults. So yeah, this is the final slide that I have. It's just a summary of what I just talked about. So I would end it here. Thank you for your attention. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Choi, for your presentation. She has introduced us some of the very fundamental theoretical debate on this issue, how all the theories have actually evolved. She showed us some general trends in comparative way between younger adults and older adults, and how the individual characteristics can moderate the result. She also introduced some other her own result findings and gave us at the very end some recommendations for policy intervention. So thank you for that. Actually, I was being very reflective of myself and of my parents actually hearing her presentation. So thank you. Okay, so we have about 23 minutes left before this session ends. I have received some questions, comments from online and also from the floor here. And I have my own question too. Let me do this. I have actually selected some of the questions for each of the presenter today. I'll briefly go through one by one, and in the order of today's presentation, for example, Dr. Micton first, maybe you will have about 3 or 4 minutes to answer this question, and maybe if you have question for other presenters, if we have time at the very end, we will have that discussion. So let me, okay, I have nicely. So first question goes to Dr. Micton, and I think this is more of institutional efforts that made by WHO. It seems very significant that WHO, as the most influential international organization on public health, has taken an initiative to address loneliness. Could you tell us more about the background in which this organization has come to take this initiative? and WHO's future plan, including Global Commission on Social Connection. Actually, I'd like to add a few points. I'm very curious because it's really hard to move an organization or a government to initiate a new topic or new agenda. And I was wondering, adding to this question, was there some sort of dynamic within the organization? Was there a strong leadership? Or was there like a study group, or was there someone, group of initiators who kind of pushed this through within the organization? So that's first question for Dr. Micton. Second question goes to Dr. Lim. You talked about one size does not fit all, and I'm thinking that this is a very fluid. So to address this issue, you have to be fluid. The policy interventions has to be fluid and has to be varied according to different culture, region, local context, etc. But do you find any, like a fundamental common spaces or some sort of like a principle that's common to all cultures that can go across all the cultures? If you have found anything during your research and networking, could you share with us? And my third question goes to our third and fourth presenters. Maybe you can divide among yourselves. You have introduced like two intervention case studies in your slide, and the question that came to me is, within that context, there are many interventions that have been made to combat loneliness in Europe. What proved to be most effective and why? I think adding to your already mentioned two cases, do you find any like significant cases that you want to share with us? And also adding to this, what is your next agenda in terms of research plan in this issue? I'm very curious about that too, as coming from a policy institute. Last question goes to Dr. Choi. What are the most urgent interventions do you think Korea needs to take to address and combat loneliness, particularly among the older people? So these are 4 questions that came to me, and I'd like to ask you to answer this question. First, Dr. Micton, can you start?
Sure, yeah. So, yeah, the question about how this issue has kind of risen up the priorities of WHO. I think there was a context in which all this happened, which I think most of us are aware of. There was the COVID pandemic that really highlighted this issue in many, many people's minds. I think this really brought home this issue. But I think even before the COVID pandemic, as I said in my presentation, the issue of loneliness, social isolation was rising up the policy agenda in many high-income countries. I mean, in England, well before the pandemic, in Japan, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in the US. So it was rising up the policy agenda in many countries, and I guess WHO had to kind of pay attention to this. And then there was also the launch of the Decade of Healthy Aging in 2021. And within the decade, it became quite quickly clear that this issue had to be addressed. So I think these are kind of the background factors that prepared the ground for a greater interest in this. And then within the organization, well, I guess it's really myself and a colleague or a couple colleagues that have been pushing for this. And we haven't quite succeeded yet. We're hoping to establish this global commission on social connection, and we have the support of our directors and the assistant director general, but we're still waiting for the final approval of Dr. Tedros, the director general of WHO. But everybody so far has been very, very supportive, and we've tried to make the case, the WHO really has to be addressing this issue as best we could. Trying to emphasize that this isn't some kind of peripheral soft issue that we can simply ignore. This is an issue that has very serious, as we mentioned in many of the presentations, many very serious implications for health. It's as important a risk factor as smoking, as obesity, maybe more, maybe less, etc. So we've really tried to bring home the fact that this is an important health issue, and WHO cannot be seen not addressing. So we just first spoke to the director, then the assistant director general, and now the director general, trying to persuade them. And they've been very receptive, and I think people have understood that this is an issue that has to be addressed by WHO. I think one of the challenges we'll face within WHO is a global organization, and its focus is mainly 80% of the people live in low and middle income countries. So its focus is mainly on low and middle income countries. The challenge will be to reframe loneliness and social isolation as truly a global issue. At the moment, it's really more a high-income country issue, mainly countries like the UK, the US, Netherlands, Korea, Japan, etc., that are taking this issue seriously. In those countries, that has risen up the policy agenda. In the rest of the world, it's often perceived as very much a secondary issue, and we have to try to change that because, of course, from the epidemiological data we have, we know that loneliness and social isolation occurs at prevalence rates that aren't very different. Some places higher, some places lower, but aren't very different from high-income countries, and have the same health consequences. So, there's no reason it shouldn't also be rising up the policy agenda in low and middle-income countries. So that's a little bit about the background to how these issues have started to rise up the policy agenda within WHO.
Thank you for that explanation. I hope Korean government pays attention to today's forum to start supporting WHO. Dr. Lim?
Thank you, Dr. Zhang, for the question. It was actually also a very difficult question, and I don't know if my response is going to do it justice, but it's going really back to the principles and definitions of how loneliness comes about, and this is a subjective feeling, and therefore there is no one size fits all. But even across cultures, I think what's really important is really asking the question of what's a meaningful social interaction or relationship for that person. For some of you may know there's different kinds of loneliness or subtypes of loneliness, intimate, social, emotional. And there are people who feel less lonely, just even having kind of meaningful social interaction with people they're not within their family, maybe just people that they just come across. So they don't actually have to be friends with those people to actually find some relief from loneliness. So it's really around what's meaningful to that person, and it can differ across cultures. And we know actually in a lot of research with young people, for example, they favor more quantity of relationships as opposed to quality relationships. And again, whether that's right or wrong, there's intergenerational issues around how we defined it. Their loneliness may be a consequence of feeling like they don't know that many people, and those relationships they know are not of the quality that they expect. So I think finding what's meaningful to them will always be critical, and this is why we always advocate for the lived experience. And for some of you who don't know the term lived experience of the person who we're trying to assist or empower, that literature really comes from the mental health literature, where there's a change in the way we think about how we help now. Traditionally we often kind of go with the traditional models where the doctor knows best, but now we're kind of going into this phase where actually we need to integrate the lived experience of the person that we're assisting. If not, program uptake will be poor or retention will be terrible. There's no point if we kind of deliver these sorts of interventions or at any level, but if we don't integrate that lived experience or incorporate their opinions and co-design those things are really likely not to work.
Oh, thank you so much. I clearly understood. So it has to be that person oriented, or service recipient oriented, not from the service giver point of view, but that could be one of the principles that we could all apply to across cultures and religions. Thank you so much. Next question to Ms. Sandu and yeah, your colleague. Thank you.
Thank you. So to your question, what we do have in our report, so we presented 12 case studies, promising, if not good practices on how to tackle loneliness and social isolation. Since true data on impact and cost effectiveness is lacking, what we did, we had a sort of an expert consultation, and we looked at these practices from the perspective of transferability and from the perspective of scaling up. So we had a clear task with a clear client in mind. So Spain needed examples and solutions, and that's how we approached them. So what could be transferred, what could be scaled up, what has the potential to be systemic. What is important is to truly understand that, you know, small measures should top up into a clear plan, into a systemic plan. Otherwise, they remain small actions locally or regionally. So there are just very few countries in Europe that have a national approach. One is the Netherlands, for instance, that has a clear strategy, a national strategy to combat loneliness and social isolation, the UK as well, but all others treat this matter fragmentally, and you find them in various strategies and no clear understanding of how things will come together to a national impact. So yeah, this was a bit our approach. Yeah, it's very interesting to see how a very small application in France brings youngsters and older together for meals. But it's another thing to see how Mona Lisa truly put a national framework in place that works for combating isolation and loneliness. And it's also very interesting to look how a very small initiative at local level in Norway, like bringing all the people together in supermarkets to cook together, to have cooking classes, then this expands to a regional national strategy of age-friendly communities in Norway. And that's what it happens. So being systemic, checking what works, having resources and data to back up all these solutions is the way forward in our opinion. And then I will give the floor to Esther to add and reply to the second part of the question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, in terms of future research, I think there is still a lot to be done. And as the other presenters also noted, that many of the evidence that we already have, but it's really not systematized and reviewed. So I think there's definitely one area also in Europe that would need to be done, in addition to all these kind of data collection, investment in data infrastructure, implementing the panel or longitudinal data that also allows for comparison across countries. As you know, in Europe, the European Union is also kind of an entity that brings together initiatives and policy that then provides guidelines and frameworks for the member states. So comparative research in this regard would definitely be very helpful in the European context. And just to also add to what Veronica has mentioned in terms of the lack of these kind of national strategies that specifically address this phenomena. I know that there is increased research going on, for instance, in Germany at the moment. Germany is planning to launch a national strategy on loneliness, and they require more evidence and research. So there is ongoing studies that are implemented, for instance, in Germany. So the strategy can be supported by all available evidence that is there. And this is just one example that I think this is a topic that is definitely is gaining more recognition in Europe as well. And countries are also kind of getting, starting to do more research and also building in this topic in, for instance, the national aging strategies, even if it's not specific to combat loneliness.
Thank you so much. Hearing from Ms. Sandu, I was thinking, oh yes, we need national strategy, but don't think it too difficult, you know. We can start from like communities. What can we do together at the very community level, like in supermarket, maybe we can do something together, and that can be rolled out. So thank you so much, and thank you for sharing the next step. I think your study can be like a reference point for many other countries, especially in Asia, Southeast Asia, and also some comparative context too. So thank you. Professor Choi, can you share like your thoughts on like how South Korea can do better, or how South Korea can start intervening in this issue?
Yes, well, like I said, I'm not an expert on policy issues for older adults, for any group actually, really. But one of the things that I noticed is that the poverty rate of senior citizens in Korea is staggering. I believe the latest data that I saw was 3 times that of the average of the OECD countries. So I think almost half of the senior citizens in Korea are under the poverty line, which means that they are also socially isolated, because if you look at the data on the relationship between socioeconomic status and perceived social support, there is definitely a strong negative relationship between those two. So I think targeting specific group of these underprivileged senior citizens would be the most important thing to do, because they're actually are most in need of those health services, social services.
Thank you. I think South Korea has a long way to go, and hope this forum can be a good kickstart to carry out or start that discussion. Before closing, I'd like to actually share my own thoughts too. Hearing from all these experts from Asia and from Europe, I came to think about 2 points. First point is about the can the feeling of loneliness be an asset? Can this be empowering? A little bit of twist, because we know that older people has a lot of capabilities. They have experienced a lot of things. They have wisdom. They are resilient. They have gone through so many life experiences. So why I was thinking this, because in gender studies, we oftentimes look at women as someone vulnerable. And a lot of feminists argue that no, that's not the only fact. They are someone who's capable, and especially these are discussed in gender and disaster literature. So from that perspective, I was thinking, how is there any way this loneliness can be empowering? Can this be shared? Or someone who has overcome this loneliness, can this be shared down to generations? So that's one point that I wanted to mention. Maybe there are already studies, it's just that I don't know. Second, some of you already have mentioned, I'm actually doing a lot of official development assistance project from South Korean government to Southeast Asian countries and some of the other, South Asian countries. And aging is becoming more and more problem in those countries too. And I really hope the developing countries can come into this discussion, and we do a lot of, I hope, cooperative projects on, finding their situation, building up statistics, because this is, I think, a global issue now, not only, in developed countries, but also developing countries, underdeveloped countries as well. So with that, I think we have like 2 minutes. Do you have any pressing question or comments among our, speakers that you want to address? Any ending comments? Okay. Thank you so much for your time. 2 hours full of discussion and good questions, actually. And I hope this will only be a beginning for our talk. And I hope our center will also carry out this theme in forward and in the future as well. So thank you so much for your time and attention. Bye.
Thank you. Please give them a big hand.
Thank you.
And would you please remain on Zoom because we are taking photo together. So please wait on Zoom. And I'll invite the distinguished guest in person here to the stage. So to commemorate this valuable moment, we are going to take photos together. So please come to the stage. And we are going to take photos now. Please look at the camera and please smile. And we have all the speakers on screen and also attendees in person on stage. So please give a smile. Please give a smile. Wow, thank you. Thank you. You may return to your seat. And all the speakers, really thank you for your presentation and discussions. I think your just valuable presentation and discussion really help us understand these issues. Thank you. And my special thanks also go to the moderator, Professor Chang, for moderating this special session. And I really appreciate all the attendees, both online and offline, for being part of us over the past 2 days. And your participation and enthusiasm in this forum make this forum more valuable and also more productive. So I really appreciate that. And I think it's already time to call it a day and to conclude this forum. So the chairperson of Board of Directors, Haekyung Lee of ASEM Global Aging Center, will deliver the closing remarks. So please welcome her with a big round of applause.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, our distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends, now it is the time to bring an end to our second ASEM Forum on Human Rights of Older Persons, Present and Future. I would like to begin this closing remarks by extending my deepest gratitude to all the organizations, speakers, moderators, presenters, and guests who have made great contributions in various ways to make this event very successful. And I also like to express my special appreciation to our co-hosts, the National Human Rights Commission of Korea and the delegation of European Union to the Republic of Korea for their unsparing support and the strong trust bestowed on us to make this important international endeavor meaningful. During last 1.5 days, government officials, representatives of international organizations, academic researchers, and civil society activists and practitioners from ASEM partners of all regions came together and discussed issues around this year's topic, the human rights and the mental and emotional health of older persons. As the World Health Organization, WHO, has emphasized recently, the poor mental health must be recognized and treated with same urgency as poor physical health, as it is essential to the overall health and the well-being. At least one of the 4 older adults experience some mental disorders such as depression, dementia, anxiety, and the number of older people with mental disorders is expected to double by 2030. In addition, the people aged 85 and older has the highest suicide rate of any age groups. However, the mental, emotional health problems in older people often go unrecognized. Given the rapid aging of the global population, the mental and emotional health and well-being of the older persons should be recognized as a priority for health, learning, productivity, and social inclusion. Therefore, the ASEM government should be more proactive in taking action to ensure the mental health of the older adults. And moreover, furthermore, COVID-19 and the associated lockdowns have increased loneliness among older people and contributed to heightened concern for their mental health. The ASEM Global Aging Center has taken this forum as an opportunity to pay close attention to the mental and emotional health of older adults and to provide a space for the government officials and representatives, international organizers and academicians and the practitioners from ASEM partners of all regions discuss what action can be taken, especially in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The forum consisted of 4 sessions, including a special session with WHO, which came in as a last session. In the first session, the academic researchers and experts in mental and emotional health of older persons examined the current status of mental and emotional health issues and discussed what countermeasures can and have been adopted. 3 very excellent papers presented by Dr. Banerjee, Apollo Hospital in India, and Professor Ha, Seoul National University of Korea, and the Sonu Lee, Palakik University, Czech Republic. And their presentations was extensive and very comprehensive and with the full of suggestions and also the points to be taken to develop the better system of mental health for the older persons. And the second session, Civil Society Talk Concert we have a subtitled Sharing and Exploring Rights-Based Community Building Practices. And we have invited 8 NGO activists and practitioners who have been involved in human rights-based community building practices in ASEM partner countries. Jo Hyun-se, self-help group in Korea and other Asian countries, and the Dreamlike Neighborhood in Vietnam, and Dreamlike Neighborhood in Vietnam, and it was presented by Elena and Susan. And the Intergenerational Self-Help Clubs, ISHC development model in Vietnam, and a strong program in Thailand, and collaborative municipal community model for comprehensive elderly care in Tomoya, Suzuki, and lastly, the Kensuke Sugawara housing complex as one big family. They were introduced, and this session was intended to create an opportunity to hear and share the voices from the ground. We are particularly interested to learn what human rights-based community building practices or projects have been invented and implemented by NGOs based in ASEM partner countries, utilizing their different material and cultural resources. And in the third session, today's sessions, government officials and policymakers from ASEM partners discussed and shared how they incorporated the issue of loneliness and psychological health into their national policy agendas and the challenges they faced when they implementing the policies. We have invited speakers from let's say, Japan, UK? No? Oh, she didn't appear. Sorry. And Japan, Germany, and Korea. So they have shared their experiences from the various perspectives. And the fourth session, the last session, was the special session. As I mentioned before, it was prepared with WHO, who has published the advocacy report quite recently. And I have to announce that this report has been fully translated into Korean, and it is available on the WHO's website. And in this session, the leading writer, the Christopher Micken, the leading author of the brief, and 4 other speakers were invited and discussed not only the brief's key findings, but also the many other issues. It was a session which really raised the awareness of the effects of social isolation and loneliness of older people's mental health and quality of life. I sincerely hope that the discussions and information shared during this fruitful forum will help you to develop the better system and to prepare the next step in each different context of each different countries. And also, I hope the insights we gained during last 1.5 days will facilitate the international cooperation and the international cooperation to protect the human rights of older persons. And I'm confident that the role of the ASEM Global Aging Center as an internationally specialized institute in dealing with the various issues, including loneliness and isolation, the poverty and other things, to protect the human rights of older persons will become even more important in the years to come. And the ASEM Global Aging Center will continue to bring together various actors from ASEM partners to achieve these goals. Okay, once again, I would like to convey special thanks to the organizers of this important event and all the participants for their engaging in informed and committed discussions. I truly hope and believe that this forum will be a valuable addition to the global endeavor to make global society more equitable and freer from discrimination for all. I look forward to seeing and working with you again in the future. Thank you for attention.
Thank you. Thank you for the remarks. So the chairperson just summarized what we discussed through this forum, and also she promises that ASEM Global Aging Centers will just constantly pay attention to these issues to resolve the mental and physical the problems of older people. Really, thank you. And also, thank you for your efforts and dedication you have made to organize this event. Well, we hope this ASEM Forum on Human Rights of Older Persons reach out to more countries beyond ASEM member states to promote discussions and cooperation to protect the human rights of older people across the world. So to this end, we need your participation and also support. So please help us and always stay with us. Stay with us so that the ASEM Global Aging Centers will take the lead in that cooperation. And with that, I'll conclude this special session and also the day 2 of this forum. Once again, thank you all the attendees, and I look forward to seeing you next year. Thank you and goodbye.